my connection with the Jewish Community Center started much before John Street. The program when we were children, young children, was at all the high holidays. We never had any shul membership. That was beyond us. So we would go to the Cannon Street shul, and then we'd break off, and so we said, "Where are you davening this year?" "Oh, we're going to Hess Street shul." So go to Hess Street shul, they ask the same question later on. "Oh, Ferguson Avenue." And that was, we would rotate between them. But then when I got to be about 12 years old or so, my father decided that even though we had no assets, that he still should have a bar mitzvah and I should get started. So I was enrolled in the Talmud Torah on Vine Street, and the teacher was Miss Sylvia Croach, and the principal was Mr. Katz, and I was put in a class with little children. It was very embarrassing, so I had to learn in a hurry. So I learned to read in 4 or 5 weeks and went on from there. And then I had my bar mitzvah at the Cannon Street Shul, as it was called then, the Addis. And I remember vividly my bar mitzvah. And there was a dinner at our house on 99 Mary Street, and I remember my grandmother came in from Buffalo, and some other relatives, and my brother Harold, he was one of the rare ones at that time, an older brother. He had a job, and I think he was making $18 a week, and he gave a whole week's salary to buy the food for the bar mitzvah. And at that time, I thanked my parents for, when they came to visit me when I was in hospital, and they came every week for 10 months. And that was a kind of a reward. And
when you were, who taught you bar mitzvah?
I'm pretty sure, it was Mr. Katz. Mr. Katz taught me bar mitzvah, and 20 years later, I went back to him to teach me again for my wedding, in honor of my father-in-law, who was traditional. And so 20 years later, he taught me the mafter, and I did the cant, everything at that time on the little shul around the corner, which was known as the Ferguson Avenue shul. But I remember the Talmud Torah very well in that whole area. And then the first Jewish community center was about 2 doors away. And I remember at that time, I'm going back to about 1933, and my eldest brother Martin was the first and only wedding at that Talmud Torah. It wasn't Talmud, it was a community center on Vine Street. His mother-in-law at that time was Mrs. Krieger. She was a widow, and like all of us, I guess, is poverty-stricken. And I remember that the food for the guests was corned beef sandwiches, and we ran out of corned beef sandwiches, and they had to go back to the corner of Caroline and York to Scott Ginsburg and Gelber were the things, and Mrs. Gelber whipped up some more corned beef sandwiches for my brother's wedding, and I held one. I was one of his 4 brothers who held up the chuppah.
Wow. Did people hang out at that Jewish community center?
I'm sorry?
When you speak about the Jewish community center, did people go there on Saturday night, or was it like a hangout?
I don't think so. Actually, it was. It wasn't all that successful as a community center, as I recall it. There was there were two houses actually, one behind the other. It was in the days when that was permissible, and but I don't recall too much activity at the community center at that time. It wasn't until later when the community bought on John Street, and I remember Jack Schechter was a real estate agent at the time, and he managed the deal for the community, and but that was a good hangout. There we went, and I remember we had a lot of plays and so on, and skits and things of that nature, and certain of the boys in the community who had a talent. I remember his name was he was a Goldblatt, but he wasn't Canadian born. He was an immigrant Goldblatt who came over, and he had a wonderful voice, and he was always being asked to sing, and that was very good. Actually, I suppose he was replaced by Mr. Rosenshine, I guess, in later years. And Mr. Rosenshine had the wonderful voice, and he would volunteer to sing. But I do remember there was a Jewish Talmud Torah training of sorts. There was a community school, but there were also one or two men who were educated, who would run their own private school, and one of them was a man named Mr. Shapiro, not a relative of mine, except incidentally his wife was a relative of the Shapiros, but he spelled it differently. But he was creating a Hanukkah pageant to take place at the Cannon Street Shul, and he was aware at that time I was a student at the Talmud Torah, and he approached me to participate and to sing. I had no voice for that, but he was a real pedagogue. He urged me to try it. So eventually, I committed the song to memory. I didn't sing it well, but he was such a pedagogue that, my God, 6 or 7 decades later, I still remember that song.
It's in English?
No, in Hebrew. Ma shom tasi ba'eretz Yisrael, Ma shom tasi ba'eretz Yisrael. What will you do in Israel? And of course they were promoting farming and all that sort but those are the things that I remember growing up.
I wanted to ask you one other thing, Frank. I remember that during my only visit to the Beverly Golf and Country Club, if that's what it's called, I remember seeing you there eating French fries. Why I remember that, I don't know. But can you remember when that club was started?
Absolutely.
And how it came to be and
Sure.
why and stuff?
We had basically about 3 or 4 avid Jewish golfers in the whole community, and one of them was Lou Davidson and a couple of others. And the Jews, of course, were not welcome at any of the clubs. You could play at the civic clubs, but there were no Jewish members at Burlington Golf and Club or any of the others. And it was decided that'd be a good idea. So there was a meeting. The early board of the club included, I could get you the name eventually, it's on the wall at the club, but they were all Jews, of course. And we decided we were going to put in some money, and I was a charter member, and all the charter members put in some money, not knowing, just go and look. And there was a committee that went to look, and they finally settled on a farm up in Dundas, and bought that. And in the early days, there was, if I recall correctly, we used, I don't know if it was, we built something or we made use of a building that was there, and that was the first clubhouse. And there was a tragedy of sorts, and the building burnt down, and the employee who lived there lost his life in that fire. And then that was 1957, and then a number of years after that, we ran into some financial problems, and the banks were calling their note. They said they want their money, and or else you sell the club out. And so there was another committee to get the members to buy a debenture. And I recall vividly the conversation. My name was on the list. I was to be called by Philip Rosenshine. And Philip Rosenshine called me. I think he was in Florida at the time. It was urgent, and they put up some money. We need it, $25,000 to retirement from each one. And he said, and I said, okay. And he said, and then we have to have it, da-da-da-da. I said, Phil, forget. I said, yes, you don't have to sell me anymore. He went on for 5 or 10 minutes telling me how vital it was. But the debenture was paid off over the next few years. Things changed. And then the climate for Jewish country clubs became unnecessary in terms of golf, because then almost all the other clubs then began to accept Jews, and we had to reassure some members, non-Jews, that the club never ever had a program of Jews only, and I think some of the early non-Jewish members were quite surprised. They expected that, but it never was. And in the early days, we even had at one time a Shabbat dinner. And but the big mistake that was made in the early days of Beverly, and I blame these avid golfers, they wanted to be more Catholic than the Pope. So whatever restrictions the other clubs had about children and timing and all the rest of it, they carried on. And they even had a rule that under 5 years old you couldn't be on the grounds. And then one day I took Bill. He was under 5 at the time, and I got a letter telling me all the terrible things, and I was ready to throw in the sponge and say, forget it, I don't need this. But eventually I changed my mind. But the club never had good support from the Jewish community, basically for that reason. The powers that be running the club, they wanted to be just like the Goyim and all these restrictions. And as a result, the next generation of Jews didn't play golf, not to any great degree. And it's too bad. The early idea that maybe there should be some collaboration with official community that was also rejected by the avid golfers, and we paid the price. So
Nice.
as a result, today the club, I think, I don't know figures, but I would say about maybe 15-20% of the members are Jews.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that at all. Of course, I don't know how to get to the club either, but
Well,
Frank, can I ask you, can you talk a bit about the temple players and that whole era of the Jewish community getting involved in all this amateur theater?
yes, the amateur theater was certainly a big item for the Jewish community. Temple players were one group, but there were other items. There was a chap called, I remember, Leo Romberg, and this goes back to the early days of John Street. But Leo Romberg was a relative of the famous Romberg, who created musicals and so on. And Leo Romberg had, I don't know how many, but certainly more than one, and they were presented at John Street. And I remember I was in that, and then later on Delaware Avenue, we had a large number of Jewish productions, and I recall I was in one where my entry was a certain statement or so, which somebody forgot to make, and I was passed right over. I didn't get on at all. But there were others, and this was the in my speech about the Negev dinner. I go into that, and I outline that one of the plays was The World of Sholem Aleichem, and this was a play that presented on Broadway, and we played it, and in it I said that it was reviewed by the Spectator, and I said that the Spectator review said that I played Mendele the bookseller, Hamocher Svarim, and the reviewer said that I was warm and chatty. And I said, I still don't know to this day whether I was damned by faint praise or whether it was a compliment. But I did,
that's nice.
yeah.
Let me end with this, because I don't want to take up too much of your time. I just want to...
I have all the time in the world. I don't describe myself as retired. I describe myself as unemployed.
Unemployed?
Yeah.
I came to this community in 1972. In 1972, from Montreal, and there were three. In a sense, there was the Jewish Community Center on Delaware, but then you had three synagogues, and it was almost as though there were three separate communities. You know, like everything was centered around the synagogues, which was very different for Montreal, where Rivka and I came from. What I wanted to know was, if you can just remember back to when, excuse me, you were growing up in Hamilton. Was it a together kind of community? Was it a community?
No.
It wasn't?
No. The liberal congregation was on Houston Street South, and it was known as the Deutsche Schule because the early Germans who built it initially had long since gone, and there was a social gap between. And what I remember specifically was the rabbi of the temple on Houston Street was Rabbi. His name escapes me for the moment.
Elder? Felder or something?
No.
Fackenheim, was it before Fackenheim or after?
Yeah. Well, his widow worked at the on Delaware Avenue, but at any rate, he was the only rabbi in town who spoke good English, and so ipso facto he became the one that newspapers would go to each time and say, "What do you think of this, that?" And he became a sort of a spokesman for the Jewish community, even though the schism was wide apart, you know. And even today, a few years ago, a local rabbi told me that the temple was a way station on the road to Christianity. So,
the temple in
that the current
Anshe Sholem.
Anshe Sholem was a.
So this is in the spirit of understanding diversity, I suppose.
Yeah,
But you said you weren't a member of the temple when you were young.
Sorry?
You weren't a member of the
No,
Houston Street Synagogue growing up.
No, I can remember Cecil Levy, who eventually his son became Kojiko. But I remember Cecil Levy saying to me one day, Frank, he was a member of Beth Jacob, and my uncle had been a member there. So, and he said, how did we lose you? And I said, Cease, you never had me. We were never members in the sense of any shul. That was mostly economic. But I became unhappy with 3-hour programs and so on. But perhaps even a more significant item, once upon a time when we lived on Houston Street North, on welfare, and a man came knocking on the door, and he spoke to my mother, and he said, he runs a camp for poor boys, and go to camp for a week, no charge. It's Machaya. I'd never been to camp, so we're going to go to camp for a week. And he rounded up 6 boys, all Jewish, 2 Richter boys, 2 Shapiro boys, and somebody else I can't remember, and put us in his vehicle. His wife was with him. I think he may have had a little child, can't remember. But we're on the road, we're traveling, we're going to camp for a week. Never been to camp before in my life. And for free. And as he driving, he was talking to us about such things as the Jews pray in a language they don't understand. Isn't that silly? Da-da-da-da-da. And this went on and on and on. We got to the camp, and he had a couple little cabins. And I remember that night he took us out into to look at the glory of the moon and the religious significance of the sun and the stars, and more about how Jews don't understand how blah, 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 blah. Especially they pray in a language they don't understand. I had to agree with that. I could read Hebrew, I think, at the time, but I had no idea what it meant. Well, this went on for, by the time it took us to get there, and overnight, the next day, the 6 of us, or whatever, we looked at each other and says, had enough? Good, had enough. We walked out, we hitchhiked home. I remember the man's name. His name was Cuttress. And he had sort of inveigled himself into the Jewish community by, he knew how to arrange marching bands and so on. And so he was a volunteer to the Jewish community. Nobody knew what his intentions were until, but that stimulated me at that time to decide I'm going to study Hebrew. And he was a better stimulus than any of my teachers or any of the rabbis. I just had to prove to myself that this son of a bitch isn't going to be able to say that about me. And so I concentrated on my Hebrew, and I never became proficient, but at
Great
least
story.
I could understand what I was reading.
Great story.
One more question.
Sure.
We're trying to get some picture of some of the more prominent personalities of the era, and would you be familiar very much with Ken Sobel? And
Oh, very much.
Could you just talk a bit about Ken Sobel and the role that he played in the Jewish community?
Ken Sobel was an absolute remarkable person. I remember him well. Ken Sobel was a patient of mine, and I guess it's not unfair to. Was interesting. Whenever Ken Sobel had a cold or sniffles or whatnot, he'd go to bed and call me. So I would be making house calls on Ken Sobel for some really nonsensical things. But what I remember especially one day, he was holding a meeting for the JNF, for the Welfare Fund, and he was going over the list. And we were supposed to invite certain people, and there was a name there, and somebody who's notorious for either not giving or making pledges and not paying, a fairly well-to-do person. And Ken Sobel just said, "I won't have that son of a bitch in my house." That was it. But I remember.
What was he most known for in terms of the contribution he made to the Jewish community?
He was a leader, a remarkable leader. And I remember once upon a time we had a meeting at Zeke Zucker's house. And Zeke had a living room that was the sunken living room, and we all sort of sat around the living room. And the speaker was not somebody from outside, some named. The speaker was Ken Sobel, and he was outstanding. Outstanding. I had so much respect for Ken Sobel. Sure, he was flamboyant, he was a showman, and he did all these things that created a lot of, but
didn't he have something to do with this Jewish radio hour?
That's right, he ran the Jewish radio hour, that's right, and I remember I approached him once to put something on that hour and so on, and he wouldn't do it. And he explained to Gary, he said, you can't just throw this out in the air and hope. There's more to it than that. But more important, he said, this is the livelihood of the man who ran the radio hour. And it was a very popular program, and we listened to it all the time.
When was it on?
I think it was Sundays, but I can't be sure.
And you listen to it all the time. Give me a typical program. What would you hear on that show?
Oh, there'd be some thin music, tinny music, maybe some 78s that didn't sound all that good, and then there'd be the Yiddish commercials, and they were always very interesting and funny.